Okay, so the contrast to the Keynesian economic model is the classical economic model. And again, there's just some of the basics that we need to make sure that you are comfortable with as we go through these. So the classical model, the key period, of course, is the long run, aka the future, in a sense. And the idea of price flexibility is that all prices are completely flexible. There is no stickiness whatsoever in this economy. And in other words, they all adjust together. And that is what, of course, gives the classical model its distinct shape, that the LRAS, or the classical aggregate supply curve, is completely vertical. And the logic behind this is that as prices change, so as we go from one price level up to another price level, PL1 to PL2, wages would also change, all input costs would change, all of these things would happen simultaneously. So as we move from price 1 to price 2, businesses have kind of no opportunity to make additional money, as they have to raise their input costs all simultaneously as well. And that means that output stays consistent at the level Y. And we can come in and we can really say that that level Y is Y potential. And that begins to be the answer to this idea of the market tendency. And the market tends, in a classical view, to always be at potential output, and therefore always be at maximum unemployment. And as unusual as this sounds, what this really means when we come back to the key time period in terms of the long run is that idea of a long run does not necessarily mean we're always operating in the future. You can, of course, operate in the future. But if prices are completely flexible, then, for example, in a recession, when output goes down, then wages go down and prices go down, but unemployment can stay the same. And this can be a little bit unusual to visualize, but really we have some good real world examples happening right now and have in history. So for example, like the current coronavirus pandemic could certainly affect the level of output, and it could shift our level of output to the left. But as that level of output shifts to the left, as we're producing less, all prices would naturally rearrange in a way that would allow employers to very quickly keep employment levels at the same level. So this is not to say that the economy cannot produce less ever, or it can't produce more ever, but that wherever this economy moves, either to the left or to the right, it is always producing at that potential. And that, of course, is what gives us the answer to the key side of the market. This market is driven by aggregate supply only, in terms of real output, right? Output is the only thing, or supply is the only thing that affects potential output. And we can see this in two ways. First, of course, we just kind of demonstrated that moving supply to the left or moving supply to the right on this model is the logical way to change output. But we can also see that changes in aggregate demand would have no impact on the level of output, that AD could move us from a lower level of price to a higher level of price, but could not change the actual level of production that's happening. And that is because more spending or more money being pumped into the economy could create price changes, but again would also immediately create wage changes, and therefore would not affect the level of output in the economy. We're going to go a little out of order on this. This leads to a basic conclusion from the classical economists that is still supported by many classical economists today, and that is the idea that government intervention is very ineffective. Right? Changes in G, changes in taxes, changes in the money supply are all generally driving aggregate demand, and aggregate demand is not going to change Y, right? There's going to be no change in potential output or in output in general, because that's all driven by the supply curve. So when they see the economy entering a recession, they see the idea of a recession as being a decrease in output because of a decrease in productivity, because the economy is legitimately slowing down. But what role does the government or the money supply have in changing productivity? And they see no role for that whatsoever. And there are largely two explanations for that you should be familiar with and be able to recognize. The first is that the classical crowd and the neoclassical crowd are very weary and concerned about the concept of crowding out. That if the government increases spending, then someone else has to decrease spending, right? So when the government spends money, businesses can't. Or when the government spends money, consumers can't. This idea that government spending and government deficits will crowd others out. The other concern that a lot of classical economists have has to do with an idea that is today called rational expectations theory. And in a way, it's related to crowding out. It's going to sound similar to crowding out. Rational expectations says that we are smart enough to know that if the government were to increase spending, then eventually the government is either going to have to increase taxes or later they're going to have to decrease spending. That those are the only future outcomes. So we see the government spend money, and then we realize that they're going to raise our taxes, so we begin to save more money to be prepared for that tax change. So the ultimate change of government spending is really nothing on the economy because we are prepared for that. They say the same thing about the money supply. They think that when the money supply changes and the Fed prints a lot of money or digitally creates a lot of money, that we know that that's going to lead to inflation, and we immediately begin saying, I'm not rich because of this newly printed money. I'm going to need this newly printed money in order to pay for inflation. So that's not going to help. So rational expectations is that people respond to government policy in a way that is aware of what government policy will do not only now, but also in the longer term, and therefore we don't really allow government to manipulate our behavior that much. So all these government policies are ultimately, we come back to this idea, very ineffective at changing Y, or changing the level of output and unemployment in the economy. There's one more big idea that I like to make sure we give credit to the classical economists for. They are big critics of the Keynesian view that savings is bad for the economy. A lot of classical economists say that savings, as we've studied in other units, is equal to and is what fuels investment spending, S equals I. And so they say that really government policy should probably, instead of being concerned with this short-term boost of aggregate demand, which will have, again, no real impact, that the government should probably be interested, and economists should be interested in ways in which we can promote savings, which can promote investment spending, and that investment spending can have these long-run changes to aggregate supply. In other words, if we can get people saving money and moving money in the right way, then investment spending, business purchases will increase over time, and those business purchases are what can eventually create more productivity in our economy. So to summarize one more time, again, you're probably not going to see the word classical on the exam at any point, but you are going to see discussions of long run, you're going to see discussions of price flexibility, you're going to see discussions of crowding out, you might even see the phrase rational expectations or people respond quickly It's a government policy. And all of those should lead you to immediately say, when those things happen, I need to go to my LRAS. I need to go to this classical model, and I will be able to see that the only possible changes in the classical model, if we want to summarize this really quickly, classical means that a change in AD leads to a change in price level, but not a change in Y or a change in unemployment. And that is the summary that you need to be able to kind of carry forward to our analysis of certain problems that we'll look at in the future. So if you assume that all prices are flexible, how will output respond to an increase in the deficit? You have to say, well, when prices are flexible, I'm looking only at this vertical supply curve, so AD will not affect Y or not affect output.